I wanted to start, okay, this is how I'll start. So, as Isan said, my father's family is partly from Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, there's kind of a tradition that I absolutely adore. And they say in Afghanistan that when a group of people come together, they can't engage in conversation until a story has been told. And so if you'd allow me, I'd like to start with a story. It's not any normal story, but this one is my very, very favorite story of all. It's called The Tale of the Sands, and this is how it goes. Once upon a time, there was a stream, a lovely, cool, clear mountain stream. It was formed from melted snow up in the crags and peaks of the high mountains, flowing down through all kinds of rocks and through spring meadows. It eventually reached a desert. Finding itself at the endless expanse of sand, the stream was worried because it hadn't faced the desert before. But it knew that its destiny was to cross the sand. So it called out, oh dear, what am I to do? However will I reach the ocean? All of a sudden, the stream heard a voice, the voice of the desert. Listen to me, O little stream. The wind crosses my sands, and you can too. But the stream, who was young and foolish, didn't listen. Instead, he rolled forward to the sand, and before he knew it, the sand was sucking him up. His waters began disappearing without a trace. Desert, desert, he cried out. You're sucking me in. The desert, who was old and wise, grew angry at the foolish young stream. Of course I'm sucking you up, the desert replied, because that's what deserts do. Listen to me. Allow yourself to be absorbed into the wind, and you can cross me. But the stream, who was far too hot-headed to listen, he had pride, and he was happy being who he was and how he was. I'm a stream, he shouted, and I want to stay a stream. I don't want to go and change and become something else. Growing in impatience, the desert yelled out, oh, foolish stream, if you want to cross me, you've got to throw yourself into the wind. Your droplets will then soar over me and above the mountains and oceans as well. You'll become far stronger than you are now. Then, when you've reached where you need to go, you'll fall as rain. Now, the stream didn't trust the sand. It's just a trick to suck me up extra fast, he cried. Rising up into a sandstorm, the desert called, trust me, O young stream, think back to another time. Surely you can recall existing in another form. The stream thought hard, its waters swirling as its memory worked. Gradually, it did remember. It remembered a time when it wasn't a stream, but it was something else. Let yourself rise up, the desert exclaimed, up and up into the wind. The little stream did as the sand ordered, and he let himself rise in a curtain of mist until he was absorbed into the wind. It felt wonderful and right, as if it was meant to be. All this happened a long time ago, and since then, the stream has crossed the desert thousands of times. Each time, it has changed its form to achieve its destiny, although its essence has always remained the same. I first heard the Tale of the Sands when I was a child growing up in England. It was a story told to me by my father, who was usually perched at the end of my bed. When I heard it first, it was an entertainment. It was a way to help a little boy, me, drift off into sleep. But as the years passed and as the story turned around my mind, it became a part of me. And as it did so, it had an astonishing effect. Stories are the matrix by which the world was explained to me, just as they are the lens through which I first experienced it. They taught me to see the world in a way that was different from how other people perceived it. Just as how the stream remembered a time that had come before, I was always coaxed to observe life in another way, not the black and white way, black and white landscape of an English childhood, but a rich kaleidoscope of intense color. One that was a backdrop to a far more ancient way of thinking. I like to see it as a kind of thinking that's the default setting of humanity. It's locked up inside us all, right deep in there, in each one of us, and it's waiting. With the right care and attention and conditions, it can be freed and harnessed. I like to imagine it as a kind of cultural jack-in-the-box. Learn how to force the clasp, and it'll flip open and reveal a kind of thinking that most people in the Western Occidental world hardly even realize exists. It's rather like those, colored eyeglasses they give you to watch a 3D movie. Put them on and suddenly your mind is blown by the experience. The way I see it, the reason a great many cultures have an upper hand in business, in life, in culture, and in just about everything, is because they're tapping into this bedrock. It's a kind of thinking which has been laid down over millennia. There's no term for it in English, so I'm going to call it zigzag think. One of the great joys of my life, and I'm sure it's something that a great many of us share, is having lived with small children. I've got a son and a daughter, and they're now in their early teens. But when they were younger, I watched them solve problems using this kind of innate zigzag think, the programming with which they and all of us had been born. One time I remember watching my daughter, Ariane, then she was aged about 3. She had wanted to get up and see herself in the bathroom mirror so that she could apply a thick coat of cherry pink lipstick on her lips, or all over her face, because she had somehow got it. And so she had found a bucket and put it on the floor in front of the mirror. Then with great care, she'd placed my brand new Apple laptop over the open end of the bucket, and she stepped up onto it. And although horrified at the time, I've kind of looked back and I've applauded that she did this as she did, in a way using what I'm calling zigzag think. After all, most of us would have simply turned the bucket over and got up on that. Certainly there was a danger that my precious new laptop might have been a casualty, but that's not the point. Because Ariane, my daughter, was tapping into a kind of thinking that predated the way that we've all been schooled to solve problems. And in the case of Ariane and the bucket, our learned thinking may have been all the more sensible as an option. But in a great many cases, I don't think it is. Zigzag think solved the problem for Ariane. And by the time I found her standing on my laptop on bucket, she was covered from her entire face in cherry pink lipstick. And this thinking freed her, as it does all other children, to derive solutions in the most remarkable ways. And the magic wasn't just in reaching solutions, but in the actual way she perceived the world around her. Another time, Ariane was playing Lego in her bedroom. She'd stuck hundreds of pieces together in a big mass. When I asked her what she was making, she paused, and then she replied, "It's a flesh-eating dinosaur." A moment later, the flesh-eating dinosaur had fallen to the ground and smashed into lots of pieces. Ariane peered down at it, and she said, "And it is the sky at night as well." These days, my kids are older, so they tend to think in a more kind of conventional way, even though I urge them constantly to free their thinking and to do things in a way that might seem at odds with the Western world. I was obsessed that they be raised with zigzag think, with a cultural color as a backdrop as well, the kind that had percolated into my world through the stories that my father told me as a child. So preoccupied was I about this that when my kids were very little, I came up with a grand plan. We'd cash in our grim lives in rainy old London, and we'd move to Morocco to the magical realm where I'd often been taken as a child. When I announced the plan to my wife, her face lit up. Confused, she asked, "Can we afford it?" It turned out that she'd thought I'd said Monaco, not Morocco. After much persuading, she eventually agreed. So we sold our tiny apartment in London and bought a rambling mansion where Ihsan's visited in Casablanca, a house named Dar Khalifa, which means the caliph's house. It was unusual for two reasons. First, it was set squarely in the middle of a vast, sprawling shantytown. And second, it was said by everyone to be haunted by legions of evil genies, what they know in Morocco as jinns. The shantytown and the genies meant that the house was fabulously affordable. Fortunately, it being Morocco, a kind of Arabian Nights of a kingdom, bargain basement exorcists were available to chase the genies away. In fact, exorcists turned out to be so inexpensive, really recommend Morocco for exorcists, that I hired 20 of them. And over days and nights, they banged drums, blew trumpets, went into a trance, sacrificed animals, and sucked the genies out of the walls. But that's another story. Living in Morocco, I got to experience all over again the kind of zigzag think that my father had weaned me on in his stories. There's no great surprise about that, because from Morocco in the west to Afghanistan and beyond in the east, it's a kind of vast swathe of collective culture where zigzag think rules supreme. While renovating the mansion and exercising the genies and while engaging with day-to-day Moroccan life, I've been constantly astonished at the sheer genius of it all. I want to give you an example. So at the house, Dar Khalifa, we have a housekeeper, and she's called Zinab. And she's the wisest person, without exception, that I have ever met. And when it comes to zigzag think, she's in a league of her own. She's always heard me going on, groaning, moaning about how I always get ripped off when I'm buying, vegetables in the market. Because however hard I try, the stall keepers, they can see I'm not a local. So one day, unable to stand my moaning anymore, Zina beckoned me into a shadowy corner in the kitchen. And she whispered to me, "There's a secret." And I said, "A secret?" She replied, "A secret that every Moroccan woman knows and which has never, ever been told to a man. It's passed down from mother to daughter, generation after generation. And it's the secret of how never to be overcharged in anything." I leaned forward and begged, "Please, Zina, tell it to me at once." "How do I know you won't tell it to a man?" she said accusingly. "Because if it's known by men, its power will be lost." So I swore a solemn oath never to pass the secret on to anyone, especially to men from whom it's always, always been kept. So I'm surely going to be damned right now because I'm about to break the promise I made to Zinab, but I just have to. When I had made the oath, Zinab whispered the secret in my ear. "Always carry a flour sieve when you go shopping," she said. And as you probably don't know what a flour sieve looks like, a Moroccan one at least, I'll show you because I happen to have one here. Here it is. It's round and it's pretty simple and it's inexpensive. It costs about $1 in Morocco. In Moroccan Arabic, it's known as gharbol. I can see Ihsan smiling because he knows these things. And when I'd heard the secret of the flour sieve, I kind of frowned. And I asked Zinab to repeat it. And then I frowned again. And then I said to her, "Zinab, what am I missing here? What's a flour sieve got to do with anything except sieving flour?" And smiling, kind of like a Cheshire cat, Zinab beamed with wisdom and delight. And she said, "No foreigner would ever be seen carrying a flour sieve. Okay, so from then on, I've always taken a flour sieve when I go shopping. Here, I'll grab it again. I even took one when I went to buy a new car in Casablanca. I said, the salesman winked at it because it was resting on my lap. And he said, "You're one of us, aren't you?" And look at me, I've even brought one to America. But despite my high hopes, I'm not sure it's going to get me the good deals I'm hoping for at Walmart. But like changing one's form, although keeping the essence the same, and the ability to blend in, to be a cultural chameleon, I believe pays miraculous dividends. Rather than being the square peg that's always slammed into a round hole, I found that it's far smarter to allow a kind of transformational change to occur, change from the inside out. For 30 years and longer, I've zigzagged across the world and engaged with places and people in a kind of deep down way, through a kind of primeval alchemy. Like the little stream in the story, I've allowed myself to be absorbed into the wind. On my travels, I've been accepted in a way that is often unthinkable to others. It's because even before the planes landed or before my feet have passed from one country to another across no man's land, I've turned myself from the square peg into a round one. It's allowed me to perceive the world in a kind of back to front and inside out way. A realm where there are no limits at all. No limits to the people I've encountered or to the places in which I found myself. No limits to the emotions I've experienced or to the situations that have been conjured when I least expect them. But most of all, no limits to the opportunities that have presented themselves out of the blue. From my studies in Zigzag Think, I've come to understand that the best way to comprehend what's going on is to break it all down and to look at what you think you know at a kind of micro level. When I was a kid in England, all kinds of people turned up at our house in the countryside. Some of them were writer friends of my father, people like J.D. Salinger and Doris Lessing, but most of them were completely unknown. My very, very favorite visitor that we had was an Indian magician. And over the weeks he stayed, he taught me his repertoire of magic tricks. I was like 10 years old. He eventually had to leave the house because a conjuring trick went wrong and a fireball tore through the house. And heartbroken, I pledged that when I was old enough, I would go to India and I would study magic. And that's what I did. It's the kind of stage magic that's used in India by so-called godmen on a daily basis. You know the kind of thing I'm talking about, lying on beds of nails, eating glass light bulbs, walking on fire, the usual kind of godman thing. I spent months in Calcutta studying with a magician, and I eventually learned all kinds of tricks. But it's not the tricks themselves that have stayed with me so much as the preparation that went into them. The magician, who is this crazy sadist called Hakim Feroz, said I could never hope to learn the secrets of Indian magic until I had prepared myself to absorb them. He used to say that in order for a sponge to soak up ice, the ice would first need to have its form changed. It would need to be melted into water. So my magician master claimed the secret to success in anything was to train oneself to observe the world at a kind of micro level. He said that if you could look beyond that which was immediately obvious and decipher what was really going on, you could control situations and always get the upper hand. I remember sitting at a cafe in Calcutta one afternoon while studying with him. It wasn't much more than, a cluster of tables and benches in the sidewalk's shade. And I'd been sitting there for hours, having decided, not to leave until I saw something that wasn't obvious. And anyone here who's ever been to India will know that there's never any shortage of bizarre stuff to kind of amaze you and entertain. But what I was looking for wasn't the usual wild rumpus of life that's so overwhelming to the newly arrived. I was searching for a whole other level. So for the 1,000th time, I glanced out into the street and I found myself looking at a woman and a cow. It's something you see across the subcontinent and isn't very unusual at all, as anyone who's been to India knows cows are sacred there. People would pay a rupee or so to the woman who sold them a handful of succulent grass, and they'd feed it to the cow. And so I stared, and I stared, and I stared, and I stared, the woman and the cow. And as I stared, I took notice of the details: the bright orange color of the woman's sari, the mottled pattern of the cow's hide, and the way the grass had been heaped up. And the more I looked at it, the more I began to think it was ordinary. I'd been looking at it so long that I wasn't doing more than scratching the surface. But then, suddenly, it was as if something shifted inside me, as if a gear lever had been kind of moved. At that moment, I worked out what was really going on. You see, the woman didn't own the cow. The milkman did. And after he had milked his animal early in the morning, he wanted to go out and sell the milk. So he rented the cow to the woman. And each morning she'd pluck some grass in a field, and she'd lead the creature into the city. And as I'd seen, people would pay her a rupee or two for some grass, and they'd feed it to the cow. By deciphering the system, I witnessed the genius which served everyone. The milkman was happy because he was getting paid to have his cow looked after and fed all day. The woman was happy because she got a livelihood out of it. And the passers-by were happy because they received divine blessings for feeding a sacred animal. But best of all, the cow was thrilled to bits because she got fed all day long and loved by everyone. This idea of preparation taught to me by the Indian magician is something which has become a cornerstone in my life. It's an Eastern thing. And anyone who knows the Karate Kid will remember wax on, wax off. It's the same concept, that you can never hope to learn anything until you're ready, until the square peg has had its corners smoothed off. And as I traipse around the world, I see foreigners coming to blows and slipping up day and night. Often it's because they've dived in at the deep end without taking time to observe a culture from the inside out. Instead, they've tried to slam their big square peg into a dainty round hole. And they've wondered why it just didn't fit. My dad used to rant on that in the West there was far too much time spent acquiring knowledge, but far too little time actually using the knowledge that someone had acquired or gained. And like the magician who was to teach me in Calcutta, my dad rewarded us as children when we worked things out for ourselves. You know, Steve Jobs said famously, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking back. And my father was a huge believer in doing stuff, random stuff, which formed dots, the stepping stones of life. It's an obsession which I champion as well, because it's the most perfect way of getting the upper hand. As I see it, the secret of life is to do masses of seemingly random, unconnected stuff. The more you do and the more random it is, the more dots get laid down. The dots are like doors that, given the right conditions, they open in the most unexpected ways. Once, when I was in my teens, at breakfast, I expressed like a passing interest to learn about African dictatorships. And the next thing I knew, my dad had enrolled me in a little American university in Nairobi in Kenya. And I was studying the subject in an actual dictatorship, although it was quite a moderate one. This experience led me on to travel through Africa and eventually took me to Ethiopia to mount my great quest for King Solomon's mines, which is the result of partly why I'm standing here today. And over the years, I've witnessed some very, very fine examples of originality and what I call zigzag think. Examples in which ordinary people have been catapulted forward by flipping the recognized norm on its head. Someone who comes to my mind for doing this more expertly than anyone else was someone called Musa Ibrahim. I met him in the south of Ethiopia at the illegal gold mines at a place called Shakiso. I still get shivers down my spine just thinking of that place. There were thousands of men, women, and children digging with their hands. It was like something out of the pages of the Old Testament. Legions of miners scraping at the mud in which there were meager alluvial deposits of gold. Then they'd ferry it all down to the river to be panned in a system that was developed in ancient Egypt. Life was very cheap at Shaki, so every week there were terrible, terrible accidents and kids would be buried alive in tunnels. Drunken miners would kill each other over a few grains of gold. There was disease and squalor like I'd never seen. But the one man who stood out was this guy, Musa Ibrahim. He had a gentleness that put him out of place at Shakiso. He was very well dressed and seemed pretty rich. Some people told me he was a spy. Others said that he had once found a gold nugget the size of a man's fist. Over the time that I spent there at Shakiso, I got to know Musa Ibrahim. One day when we were sitting together in the shade, I asked for the secret of his success. He took a long, slow, reflective sip of his tea and he smiled. "Look at all those people out there," he said. "They're killing themselves for a few specks of gold. Anything they find today will be stolen or squandered on vice. Each day they start afresh, a little poorer than the day before." "So you didn't make your money from mining then?" I asked. Musa Ibrahim let out a kind of muffled squeal of horror. "Of course not," he replied. "From the moment I arrived here," he said, "I saw that the only way forward was to be different from everyone else. You see, the last thing that works in life," he said, "is to do the obvious. And as the obvious thing was to mine gold, I put it out of my head right away. With the little money I had," he said, "I bought some equipment and a couple of mules. I rented them to the miners and reinvested the profits. And very soon I was offering not only equipment and mules, but food, drinking water, medicines, and reliable digital scales for weighing gold dust. While the miners have stayed in limbo," he said, "I myself have progressed." And my travels in Ethiopia, gosh, they were hard going. I spent months trekking with mules through forests and even quicksand on the trail of King Solomon's gold. And at the time, I couldn't imagine more challenging journeys, a point that, with hindsight, tends to make me smile now. Because later journeys elsewhere made my times in Ethiopia seem kind of like a holiday camp. There's an Arab proverb which says, "Much travel is needed before the raw man is ripened." I've always clung to that proverb and have whispered it to myself on bleak, windswept nights when the only certainty was much worse misery ahead. And the nights were never more windswept or bleak than during a series of expeditions I made in the Peruvian jungles. The first time I went there, I was researching a book about, of all things, primitive flight and the riddle of whether ancient man could have flown. I wasn't really thinking of powered, full-on flight, but more of a kind of basic gliding, perhaps with a kind of canvas canopy or a wing or something. And after all, most ancient cultures have a myth of flight. and there's a very, very strong one in Peru. I discovered a reference in a Spanish conquistador text which said that the Incas flew over the jungle like birds. And I'd seen these amazing ancient textiles showing winged birdmen as well. I spent months in the upper Amazon, much of it with a tribe called the Shua tribe. They'd been previously celebrated for shrinking human heads of their enemies to about the size of a grapefruit. I'm happy to say they don't do that anymore, but they do still take a really powerful hallucinogen called ayahuasca, the so-called vine of the dead. When taken in the right way, it gives the sense of growing wings and flying. So I concluded that the tribe's flight was a kind of allegorical one derived from fantasy. The second big journey I made in Peru, this expedition, was to scour the cloud forest for Paititi, the greatest lost city of the Americas. It was there that the Incas are believed to have retreated once the conquistadors had routed them from their capital at Cusco. I spent 16 weeks in the Madre de Dios jungle. We had dozens and dozens of porters and a film crew in tow. And with such a large team, we needed extra porters to carry all the food necessary to feed them. It was the mother of all vicious circles. The journey introduced me to misery on an unknown scale, and I learned on that trip the ins and outs of assembling a team and keeping them together, even when they were on the point of mutiny, believe me, I mean absolute mutiny, while leading this kind of ragtag group into ever deeper jungle. I came to understand the key points of leadership. The first was never to select two people with the same skill set. The team's strength lay in its diversity and in the fact that no two men were alike. Each one had a different background and widely varying skills. And this meant that when thrown together, they all brought a kind of slightly different flavor to our human stew. And early on, I learned to reward hard work and good ideas with praise and with mountains of hot food. I always led from the front and never ate, for example, until the porters had refilled their plates a second time. And hot food is such a great motivator in the jungle. But through the months that we progressed up the swirling waters of the Madre de Dios River, I came to see the value of another quite different motivating force, the power of stories. When I was hiring the porters back in the village where the river was wide, a puny young man called Giovanni had stepped forward. Like all the others, they were built like trees, and Giovanni wasn't an obvious choice because he was like all spindly. And we needed strong men because we had to haul 2 tons of food and equipment upriver. I was about to turn this guy, Giovanni, away when one of the men shouted out that Giovanni could tell stories like no man alive. And as soon as I heard it, I hired him on the spot. And through the dark, windswept nights of many, many weeks, Giovanni told a tale that went on and on. It was a tale of demons and cannibal tribes and magical kingdoms, buried treasure, and mermaid princesses whose hair was conjured from strands of the purest gold. Each night, once the men had eaten and had their feet dried and bandaged, the tale would begin where it had left off the night before. Like a master storyteller recounting the next installment of 1001 Nights, Giovanni would tailor the evening's episode to the moment. On nights in which the weather was especially ferocious, or when we had hauled the rubber zodiac boats and rafts up terrible, terrible rapids, the story would be filled with even more dreamlike description than usual. Giovanni had the ability to gauge what the team needed. It was a rare and quite astonishing faculty, and it's one that I've never forgotten. Of all the magic in his long, twisting saga, the element that stuck in my mind more than any other was the way he breathed an emotional connection into his tale. Like a thread woven into a tapestry. It gave a quality that was in itself quite intoxicating. And it got me thinking. Emotion can be wrapped into things in a kind of Trojan horse way. So we hardly even realize it's there at all. And as in the tale that Giovanni spun in the jungle each night, this emotional paradigm seeped in through the listener's ears and into their psyche. The tale became a part of them, or rather the emotional connection became a part of them. It's something that I've given a lot of thought to over the last few years. The way that once in a long while you get a deep down emotional connection, whether it's to a story or a brand of soup that you had as a kid, to a car, an aeroplane, or anything else. Of course, there's usually nostalgia involved upon which the bond has taken hold. When I think back to my own life, an astonishing example leaps out at me, and it's this. In the summer of 1985, I bought my first car. I was 18 years old, and I had big hair, long time ago, and even bigger dreams. The car was a bright orange VW Bug, and it was so much more than getting from A to B. She was a symbol of freedom, and she cost me $50. Yes, she was a she, and her name was Millie. She was rusted and dented and impossible to start on cold mornings, which was every morning. And I loved her like nothing else. I confided my deepest secrets into Millie, laughed with her, and finally when I gave her away, I wept. And since parting with Millie, I've owned a number of other vehicles. Each one has come with more impressive features and warranties, and has been ever more reliable, than the last. But none has ever come close in providing the emotional connection that I shared with Millie, my bright orange VW Bug. Now, on nights when I cannot sleep, I go down into the garden and I listen to the wind in the eucalyptus trees. I think of the journeys I've made and the people I've encountered and the things that have changed me in a deep down way from the inside out. As the wind wafts through the leaves of the eucalyptus trees, I always seem to reach the same conclusion, and it's this. In our lives, we're bombarded with noise, advertising, problems, products, social media, payments, yet more payments, responsibilities, errands, chores, emails, all the rest. All of it propelled at us in an endless assault. It's overload on a monumental scale. It means that all too often, we simply tune out. We forget what happened on a particular day or in a particular week or even in a particular year. But I believe we can shift our mindset and filter out the noise by seeing the world as we know it. To see it with fresh eyes, whether it's the cup of coffee you're holding or the product you're trying to sell. You can open up whole new levels of perception by looking at something from the inside out, like the zigzag think of taking a flour sieve when buying vegetables, or how the old woman with the cow on a Calcutta street corner can be broken down and deciphered. It's part of an extraordinary framework that's usually invisible, but it's always there. And as society has progressed, moving forward at, in the most astonishing ways, so has society lost the faculty of perception. We're bombarded with so much noise that we filter out just about anything of any importance as a kind of survival mechanism. But the good news, I believe, is that we can relearn to appreciate things as we as humans once did. We can relearn to see and absorb the subtleties in ideas, in thinking, and even in stories. The result is, as I said, putting on a pair of 3D glasses at the start of a superhero movie. It's electrifying. We can relearn to perceive things and ideas in new ways, or rather in old new ways, because zigzag think and the ability to see with fresh eyes isn't new at all. It's as old as time itself. Thank you.